Hello there. This month I read The Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell. Karl Norden was an unusual man. He was a Dutch engineer who worked 18-hour days in secrecy, wore three-piece suits, mistreated his employees, and demanded perfection. His company invented the bomb sight, using 64 algorithms to predict how to land a bomb onto its target precisely. After World War I, many people dreamed of a war without millions of dead ground troops. Up until that point, pilots were essentially throwing bombs out of windows and hoping they hit something. But the Norden bomb sight changed all this. The U.S. military bought thousands of them. They were basically 55-pound analog computers with telescopes. It required 6 months of training, and operators were sworn to secrecy. Norden's business partner was Tad Barth, who claimed the bomb sights could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. A dozen young pilots called themselves the Bomber Mafia. They worked at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. Originally, they were in Virginia and served the Army in traditional ways. The official Army doctrine was to bomb your enemy under the safety of darkness, but the Bomber Mafia wanted to fly planes during the day. The Air Force wanted to be modern compared to the other branches. In 1936, a flood brought Pittsburgh to a halt, and the Bomber Mafia reasoned they could bring their enemy to a halt by similarly hitting their choke points. They planned that they could destroy all of New York City's electrical power with their 17 bombs. As World War II began, the Army command turned to them, and in 9 days they planned that they could force Germany to surrender with only several dozen bombs. The British Royal Air Force remained skeptical of America's precision daylight bombing, and instead wanted to do area bombing of Germany. The British had recently endured the Blitz and remained resilient, but they imagined the German people would respond differently. Frederick Lindemann was an argumentative physicist and vegetarian born in Germany. He was best friends with Winston Churchill and remembered details for him. He convinced Churchill to kill Germans indiscriminately. Haywood Hansel hailed from an aristocratic Southern family, and his favorite book was Don Quixote. He struggled to find a German target to hit. Then it occurred to him that striking a ball bearings factory could bring the entire German war effort down, since everything else depended upon it. The Air Force wanted a second group to divert Germans away from the factory, and they chose Colonel Curtis LeMay to command this group. He was from Columbus, Ohio, a stoic man who might only say 4 words in a 2.5-hour meeting. Usually a squadron would suddenly descend onto their target, but LeMay looked through books and figured it would take 277 rounds to sink a single plane. He instead ordered the planes to fly right over the target, and he didn't lose a single one. The plan was for LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing to lure Germans away to Regensburg, and then the real bombing force, the 1st Bombardment Wing, would strike Schweinfurt. LeMay left with 125 planes and lost 24. But the 1st Bombardment Wing was delayed by hours before they could take off. They lost 60 planes and 552 men, and out of 2,000 bombs, only about 80 hit. People wondered why. Possibly the thickening oils caused friction within the bomb sights. A second raid was equally unsuccessful. It looked like the promise of precision bombing had failed. LeMay was skeptical of the doctrine, but kept murals of Regensburg and Schweinfurt in his foyer. The Pacific Theater was more difficult. The B-29 had a range of around 3,000 miles, so the U.S. had to capture land within that range. 3 tiny Pacific islands, known as the Mariana Islands, which were covered in hot jungles and rats. Hansel had 119 B-29s, but during the first week of attack they were overloaded by fuel and opposed by bad wind. They were to strike an aircraft factory in Tokyo, but they were hindered by clouds and the jet stream, and after 5 missions had barely touched it. Meanwhile, LeMay was stationed in Calcutta, India, and ordered to strike steelworks in Japan. 92 planes left, 47 arrived, 15 could see the target, and only 1 bomb hit the target. MIT chemists experimented with incendiary gels until they developed napalm, which caused gloves to stick onto things and keep burning and burning. They figured they could use this to burn down most of Japanese cities. As the Bomber Mafia's ideas failed time after time, Hansel was pressured to use napalm, but he was reluctant to. Then General Norstad flew in from Washington, D.C., and announced that Hansel was being replaced with Curtis LeMay. To avoid bad weather, LeMay planned to send the B-29s in at night at only 5,000 feet and drop napalm onto Tokyo. He figured it was better to have a quick than drawn-out war. On March 9, 1945, LeMay stood on the runway and counted the planes as they took off. but he couldn't sleep that night. After midnight, the B-29s arrived and began dropping 1,665 tons of napalm. All of Tokyo was on fire and looked like hell, and 100,000 people died. In the next half year, the 21st Bomber Command bombed 67 Japanese cities, even ones of no strategic importance. The army generals could not imagine what LeMay was doing. Eventually, the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, and the Japanese surrendered. High-altitude precision bombing has improved even more since then. Today, you could kill a man sitting in a room without harming the floors above or below him. We have a lot to learn from this experience. The inventors and commanders behind World War II's precision daylight bombing campaigns were not exactly pleasant men. They would be labeled as toxic and get canceled on Twitter today, but they did something valuable that saved America's butt, and we should all be grateful for them. If any of these great men from World War II were airdropped into America today, they would likely not be allowed to ascend into positions of leadership, nor even allowed into a good college. They would instead be labeled as problematic white men. The expected behavior of a public figure today is much more feminine, politically correct, and risk-averse. Even Elon Musk, who invented electric cars, is labeled by much of the press as beyond the pale for his very mild trolling. I also reviewed the movie Lancaster Skies. In spring 1944, Flight Lieutenant Douglas Miller, a former Spitfire pilot, departs by train to take the job of skipper to a bombing squadron. He is ready to work hard on day one. But the men of this squadron, Charlie, George, Henry, James, Robert, and Thomas, prefer drinking, gambling, and women. Douglas remains reserved and is having none of their frivolity, and the others regard him as an odd fish. George Williams is the smarmiest man among the crew, but befriends Douglas and serves as his guide around their base. He figures they ought to have fun, since they could die any day. The most hostile crew member is Charlie Moore. He is reluctant to even salute Douglas, but after he vomits on Douglas's shoes, Douglas kindly sees that he gets home safely. A woman named Kate takes a romantic interest in Douglas. They eventually go on a date to see a Laurel and Hardy film, and share that they both have dead brothers. Eventually, the crew is sent on a bombing run to Berlin, Germany. A battle takes place, and many planes are lost. Douglas's crew successfully bombs the target, but shortly afterward, their bomber is hit and the crew injured. They think they can return home or bail, but in the final moments, they choose a crash landing, and presumably, they all die together. The cinematography is expert, and shows characters through train windows and bedroom mirrors. I enjoy the lighting, whether it's Douglas smoking a cigarette on an overcast British morning, or explosions against the night sky. Flashbacks show Douglas's childhood, and the action figures and posters he owned create an emotional core. The clothing, both military and civilian, has a real texture to it, and the bomber planes look good. The dialogue seems convincing for mid-century British people. The music is pretty good too, like when Douglas takes hold of the plane's steering wheel for the first time. Even though the cast is mostly British men who I've never heard of before, I could tell them apart. My favorite character is the main character, Douglas. His stiff expression and haunted eyes make me feel a lot of empathy for him. It's a pretty simple plot, and only 98 minutes long, but you can feel the director has a true and childlike love and honor for the Royal Air Force. I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. How would I improve it? I would remove the opening scene, where the previous skipper named Alfie dies, and I would try to give Douglas an emotional arc with each of his crewmates. There are scenes involving boxing and reselling a boot that could be modified to create those emotional arcs. The bombing at the end reminds me a lot of the assault on the Death Star at the end of Star Wars: A New Hope, but it could have been shot in a more dynamic way. And as an optimist, I think there should be a happier ending, where Douglas lands the bomber safely and kisses his girl, Kate. And that's my book and film review. Thanks for viewing. Bye.